Right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome again to Maastricht University Campus Brussels for our third session of today. And it's a dialogue on employment, labour mobility and social inclusion with Joost Korte, the Director General for DG Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion at the European Commission, who's here on my left. Then we have Jeroen Lenaers, a member of the European Parliament from the CDA in the Netherlands, and Wouter Zwysen, a senior researcher at the European Trade Union Institute. So thank you to all three of you for joining me here to talk about this topic. We're really happy to have you here at the Campus Brussels. My name is Claire Fennick, for anyone new joining us on Zoom. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Studio Europa Maastricht at Maastricht University, where I focus on topics linked to labour market risk and social protection. In terms of our session this afternoon, I'll start by properly introducing our three fantastic speakers here, and then we'll begin with our dialogue. And that will last about 45 minutes. And after that, we'll open up the discussion to the audience and take questions from both those here in the room with us and those on Zoom. For our Zoom attendees, please write your questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to get to all of you. So, some proper introductions. Joost was appointed Director General of DG Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion in early 2018. Previously, he served as Deputy Director General in the European Commission's Trade Department, in the Agriculture and Rural Development Department, as well as in the Enlargement Department. Furthermore, Mr. Korte spent several years in the Commission Secretariat General as the director responsible for the relations with the Council of Ministers and gained extensive experience in the private offices of Sir Leon Britton, Chris Patton, and Danuta Hübner. Originally, Mr. Korte was a lawyer by training, following 8 years of academic work on European law at the universities of Utrecht and Edinburgh. And Jeroen Lenaers has been a Dutch MEP for the Europeans within the European People's Party, the EPP, and the CDA, the Dutch Christian Democrats, since 2014. He was born and raised in the Dutch-Belgian border region and is now highly involved with cross-border activities, for example, in the coordination of social security taxes and cross-border employment and pension schemes. As a member of Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion, the Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs, and the Budgetary and Budgetary Control Committees, he stands for a Europe that guarantees European added value for all citizens. Now, Wouter Zwysen. Wouter is an expert in labour market inequalities, drivers of wage inequalities, labour market integration of migrants and minorities, and the quality of jobs. He has degrees in political science and social policy analysis from the University of Antwerp and the Catholic University of Leuven. He gained his doctorate at the Institute for Social and Economic Research at the University of Essex in applied social and economic research. Previously, he worked as a postdoctoral researcher on the European research project, Growth, Equal Opportunities, Migration in the Markets, and then at the OECD in the Employment, Labour and Social Affairs Directorate, carrying out research on wage inequality and firm productivity. So I'd like to start off the first question today, quite simple, and it is simply about the European social model and what does the European social model mean to you, and why are the values that it incorporates important and worth pursuing? So we perhaps can just go down the line.
Yeah, thank you very much first of all, for organizing this event. It's always good to see that there's so much interest among young people for the topics that I'm dealing with, like my colleagues here on a daily basis, and I find it also very inspiring to get feedback and be criticized, and so please feel free to do so. I mean, the social Europe, what does it actually mean? This is a very good question to start with. For me, it is actually sufficient to read some parts of the treaty. If you read the Treaty on the European Union and you read the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, you see that there is the social market economy at the heart of it. A highly competitive social market economy is what it says. Sorry if I keep it a bit closer to my mouth. This has been, of course, further than specified in other important articles of the treaty. It means, first and foremost, I think, free movement of workers and everything that goes with it. This is a core freedom that we all enjoy and that we should cherish, and that has been working with a lot of caveats actually rather well, and which is also a motor for not only for integration but also for prosperity. Secondly, it also means a lot of proposals for legislation in the area of labor rights. There's a specific article in the treaty on this. It gives the European Union the power to legislate, and we've done that many, many times, starting with the occupational health and safety area, safety in the workplace, so very active. And later on, notably after Maastricht, the Maastricht Treaty, also in other areas, working time directive, equal pay for men and women, work-life balance, transparent and predictable working conditions, and now we are working on minimum wage and also on platform work. So it's quite a lot of activity going on. And then we have in other areas like social policies, less hard competences, but still a lot of work which is going on to essentially bring member states closer together. I think it's in a single market and in the Eurozone even more so not sustainable to have big differences between the member states. That's also what we're doing. All of this, to sum it up, I mean, this is a bit of a bureaucratic list of things, but nevertheless important. What it's all about is, I think, the type of societies that we want to have, and that we do actually have in Europe, and which we should be, in my view, extremely proud of. The European Pillar of Social Rights is, I think, expresses this rather well with its 20 principles. It was given an enormous boost by Jean-Claude Juncker in the previous Commission, and we should be very grateful to him for bringing this back to the fore so explicitly. And this is driving our work. I also think that why do so many people want to go to the European Union? It's also because of this, because we have this society of ours with a lot of values and the social market economy. And I don't think Mr. Putin would ever sign the European Pillar of Social Rights. Biden perhaps, but Trump certainly not. And it makes us a bit special, but I think we should be proud of it. And I say this on the day, of course, that our hearts and minds are also with everything that's happening in the Ukraine, which is a tragedy, but which also in a way shows how we can, I think in the end, very well integrate all the refugees that are coming and that may want to stay with us. I hope that's more or less clear. Thanks a lot.
Yes, I think it's an interesting question, because if you ask me, why is the European social model important to me? My first counter question would be, is there such a thing as a European social model? Because I remember also in my own political group, whenever the term European social model appeared in a text of the European Parliament, there would always be amendments from certain of my colleagues as well, adding the S to model, claiming that there are more social models in Europe than one social model that we all adhere to. And I think that's also interesting to take into consideration. I agree with Joost when he talks about this idea of a social market economy and how clear the treaty is on that. And I was always surprised, because I thought, that was me, my young naivety, that was something that was there from the start of the European Union. And I was very surprised that the words social market economy actually only entered the treaty, and I think the Treaty of Lisbon in 2007. So Maastricht, Nice, Paris, none of that had social market economy. They always talked about an open market or an internal market or a common market, but never of a social market. So I think in that respect, the European social model is something maybe we neglected a little bit in the past. And I think from 2014 onwards, when we had Jean-Claude Juncker indeed, who finally stated that apart from being a financial AAA status, Europe should also become a social AAA status. I really think we saw a little change in mentality, and I think the pillar of social rights is important in that. I just also there I need to say, yes, I don't think Putin would sign it, Trump certainly not, but at the same time, I'm from the Netherlands. When Prime Minister Rutte was asked about the pillar of social rights after it was signed, he said, yes, it's a nice little book, but I don't think I'll put it in my bookcase. So yes, it is signed, but I think there is still a daily battle in order to make sure that the pillar of social rights is not only a nice little book that doesn't feature in the Dutch Prime Minister's bookshelf, but that it becomes a daily reality in the lives of European citizens. And I agree with a lot of what Joost said about the things that we've done with the Posting of Workers Directive, with the creation of the European Labour Authority to make sure that also we can improve our cross-border cooperation in inspections, in standards, with I'm not sure if you should mention it, but the regulation of the coordination of social security, which we are working for 6 years already to try and improve it, on minimum wages, on platform work. There's a lot that's being done, but often in the face of great opposition. I mean, and I also reflect critically on my own political group in that sense. We had a vote in the plenary today whether or not to attack the mandate that was given to the Employment and Social Affairs Committee on pay transparency. And we all know that pay transparency can be hugely important to bridge the gender pay gap. But a large part of my political group says that's too much European interference in national affairs. And this is always when you talk about the European social model of social affairs, there's always a very heated discussion on whether or not Europe even has the competences to take action in a certain area, which often hampers also the effectiveness of the European Union. So I think a lot of good things are happening, but it remains a battle and we need to keep fighting it.
I'm going to steal the microphone because that was not working. I will echo a bit what's been said already. I think it's interesting also to think of social model versus social models. But in my view, and I need to clarify that I am different from the two actual policymakers sitting here as being a researcher, but in my view, it's really more the process that we're going towards, which I think the two speakers before me have highlighted with all the legislation coming up, all the work being done, and a continuously improving part of the union, which really enlightens this social model for me, which is in the social market economy, limiting the excesses of too big inequality, having strong social dialogue, having strong collective agreements. I think these are things that do bind the European member states and are important and come up a bit in the pillar of social rights, but really can and deserve to be fleshed out more, deserve to be work more and become more and more reality is my point on this. So I think very good work is being done and the social model is being built, but has to continue being built.
Yeah, so perhaps I can pick up on that point about, do we have European social models, plural? And in a way, is this if we have social models and not one social model, is it something that both unites and divides? And what are the challenges that we might face if we do have diverging European social models? How can we work as a European Union?
To me, it's all a matter of perspective. I think if you look inside the European Union, it's very easy to identify different social models, because there are differences in the way member states organize their social security systems, organize their welfare states. And you also see this is the exact reason why it's sometimes so difficult to agree on legislation like social security coordination, because member states come from different backgrounds. At the same time, I think if you look at the global stage and you compare the 27 European systems to what happens outside of the European Union, I think it's fair to say that we have a European social model. I mean, for 7% of the population of the world, something we have 40% of the costs of social welfare. That really identifies that we look differently at how to protect workers, at how to organize welfare standards than the rest of the world. But I also agree that it is still an ongoing work in progress. But in that sense, comparing Europe to the rest of the world, with some notable exceptions, of course, I think you can really speak of a European social model. If you look at the differences within the European Union, yes, but the motto of the European Union is unity in diversity. And that also goes for the social part of it.
Sorry about the sharing of the microphone, but if it's okay, I just want to quickly react, because this is something actually a very important point. We speak about these differences within the European Union, and they are important, but also over time we do see convergence, even inequality between the countries. I think that's a victory, a very beneficial point that doesn't get pointed out quite as much. Inequality in wages and so on is going up in many countries, but between the countries it's actually declining. That's one of the things the European Union does stand for, the fact that we avoid some of this race to the bottom, and that's actually where the problems are. Because this is true for many workers, but not all, and we'll talk about migrants later, I think. But I think the European Union is very good at essentially increasing quality of life for almost everyone, but there are people falling through the gaps. And I just wanted to highlight this success that there also is in the wage inequality between countries actually declining, which is important. But there's a lot of work to still be done.
Yeah, I think the perspective is very important. And I was triggered by what Jeroen said about social and market economy only coming into the treaty so late. And it's true, I think, to say that the whole project of European integration started with a much more economic background. The internal market or the single market, the common market, whatever you want to call it. At the start, there was no ambition, I think, to go beyond free movement. And what that entails, of course, indirectly, for the social systems. And that's why the coordination of the social security system, which is an indispensable part of the free movement of workers, was actually the first regulation ever adopted by the European communities at the time, in December 1958. I mean, it's an anecdote I used many times, but just to explain how this went. It is from December 1958, Regulation 3 and 4. And essentially, we're still dealing with those same regulations. They were amended twice, and now we're trying to amend it for the fourth time. And then when the Single European Act came in 1986, it was actually the first time that a legal base was created to legislate in the area of labor rights. But this was, again, I think, very much against the background of single market and the fear that if you remove obstacles for free movement, there's a danger that member states start to compete with each other on rights of workers. That was very much the perspective, and that's why it came initially, as I said, on safety in the workplace, very active, and it's actually only much later on that social Europe as a concept in its own right came, and this has been a very difficult process where member states do not agree. When we make proposals, I mean, to another anecdote, it's a bit stupid, but it clarifies a lot of my daily work. I've never met anybody who's against social Europe. They don't exist. But like there are no opponents to the single market either. Still, we know that in the single market, there are a lot of problems that we cannot resolve because there's opposition. For social Europe, fine as long as you talk about it, fine as long as you pay, as long as you do it in the context of the European semester. But the moment you come forward with a proposal to actually implement it and to give it a bit of teeth and rights for people, then it gets very, very difficult. And then you're lucky if you have a qualified majority. And that is very much my experience. And this is indeed a battle that is not over at all. But it is, again, after many years of liberalization in the 90s and the first decade of this century, really until the big financial crisis, this was, I think, the overwhelming doctrine of all of us. It was only the financial crisis that actually started as a wake-up call, saying, well, what does this actually mean? And that's also why I think Juncker came in 2014, and he was very strong on this, with a very sort of political, but also his own personal beliefs. And then with the Corona crisis, we indeed learned again how important all these things in fact are. And I think now again, another crisis. I mean, there's a crisis almost every month now. Now with Ukraine, again, I think what will determine the success or failure of this massive influx? I mean, I think this morning we heard there are now 3.6 million Ukrainians in the EU, still growing fast. 6 million displaced people internally still in Ukraine who may also come. And I think we can absorb and integrate them using the mechanisms that are there, provided the member state system when it comes to social security, schooling, childcare can absorb all these pressures. And it shows how important it is to keep investing in these facilities.
Yeah, so actually my next question was going to be about some of the crises we faced. So you mentioned the financial crisis, Ukraine, we're still coming out of the pandemic. And I wondered, in our sort of current time of crises and unprecedented challenges, how do you think the European social model can navigate these issues? Can it?
It's not an easy question, but I think it's an important one, because I remember in 2008, one of the crises that Joost mentioned, I was working as an intern in the European Parliament, and we had a visitors group, and I was speaking to them, and in the newspaper that morning there was a report from the Dutch statistical agency who calculated the added value of the European internal market for the Netherlands. And the main conclusion was that thanks to the internal market of the European Union, the Dutch economy had grown significantly more than it would have done without the internal market. And it calculated it as a profit of about 1,500 to 2,000 euros per Dutch person. And the headline was, because it's a bit more catchy, is the EU provides an extra month of salary for each Dutch person. And I thought, it's not always that the EU is positively in the news in the Netherlands. So I thought I need to tell also these people that are visiting us today. So I told them, thanks to the European Union, each one of you has an extra month of income per year. And then there was one person in the group, and I thought, who stood up and he asked, yes, okay, but I used to be a truck driver, a lorry driver. My job is lost. There is now a Slovakian colleague on my truck doing my work all over Europe. I've lost the first 12 months of my income. So can you imagine that this 13th month does not really impress me? And that was for me also a little bit of a wake-up call, is that just like Joost said, in these times of liberalization in the European Union, we have come to view GDP and economic growth as an end rather than a means. And I think it should always be a means that we should have economic growth, we should have increase in GDP in order to improve the lives of our citizens, but not as an end goal in itself, because if we only do that and we forget about the fact that this economic growth should also be shared somewhat equally over our society, you will lose parts of society. And I think that should be the European social model. And I think that is very capable of guiding us through crisis, but it needs to be applied. I think if you look at the pandemic, we saw, I think, two different sides of that debate. On the one hand, all European member states and the European Commission, for instance, by launching the SURE fund to keep people in employment, but all member states also invested hugely in order to keep people in employment, in order to make sure entrepreneurs could cope through the crisis, etc. And on the other hand, we saw also images of borders being closed, cross-border workers not being able to go to their place of work. We saw migrant workers in terrible conditions, unsafe in terms of COVID. We saw cross-border entrepreneurs not being entitled to funding that national entrepreneurs were. So to conclude, I think, yes, the social model that we have as an ideal can work really well to guide us through crisis, but then it also needs to be used consistently, and not only in a national sense, but also in a cross-border sense.
I just want to quickly react on that as well, on the how the social model can help with crisis. And there's actually some of my colleagues did some very interesting work on this, on the enormous effort that has been done through short work schemes, through different ways of trying to shelter the working population in Europe. And that has been somewhat of a success, but still we see that even despite all this effort being put and all this money being spent, you do get that inequalities might still increase, that the benefits don't always come to the people who might need them most. But it is important to say that the short work schemes really helped keep employment relatively good in Europe. In a crisis, for instance, if you compare to what happened in the United States, in many other countries, the impact was much less in Europe. And part of this probably can be ascribed to social model. But I also wanted to respond right before you asked the other question about the crisis after crisis after crisis. There was, you also think you mentioned the importance of the social model in limiting competition and or something like that. I'm paraphrasing. But there I wanted to just mention that indeed it is true that with the free movement of people, and the whole aim is to avoid this problematic competition. But then we talk about, on the one hand, there's quite a lot of research at our institute being done as well on the legal inequalities that still exist for some third country nationals. They might be, which lead themselves to competition for other workers, right? If people are too dependent on, for instance, their employer for access to social security, for access to work, and for access to the right to remain, that leads to the problem of being exploited. And a second point, I think, is what the whole previous session was about, and Edwin spoke on this a lot, that you have the laws, and the laws and the regulations are good, but if they're not being enacted, if they're not being enforced, you do get exploitation, and that is exactly what's being happening in some sectors. I mean, you gave harrowing examples of the transport sector, but I think that is important to say that indeed a lot is happening in terms of regulations, in terms of directives, but as Joost also said, it's difficult to give. No one's against social Europe, but if there's no teeth in it, and if it's difficult to give anything teeth, and the European Labour Authority might be an example on this, if that can't act in order to really enforce all these laws and all these regulations we have, then there is a big problem in the foundation of the social Europe. And then on the crisis, yes, I think the European model is probably will come out well from the crisis, I hope. But I leave that to the two other speakers.
Can, for example, the action plan on the European Pillar of Social Rights help us with better implementation and help with some of these issues?
Yeah, I think the action plan is very useful because it is a further step in actually enforcing and implementing all these nice principles and all these nice words. So the action plan was also agreed upon by the European Council. So now this is a very strong mandate that the Commission has to actually come forward with, for each of the principles, an initiative. And this is what we're doing, and that's why the minimum wage proposal comes, that's why platform work is coming, that's why we're coming forward with a recommendation on minimum income. We have a communication on care, on the social dialogue, so it's a very good, I mean, sometimes we refer to it as a compass to actually do something and not only talk about it. I mean, it gets to my nerves to talk about social Europe, I can tell you. I'm totally fed up, so I much more like to do things. And move on. And this is hard work, but we're getting there. I also think that sometimes views between member states are indeed diverging a lot, but I nevertheless see also convergence. And sometimes, I mean, every cloud has a silver lining. I think also the departure of the United Kingdom in a way helps. Because they have always traditionally been very much against this concept, and many of the legal competence issues that are making it very hard for the Commission to make proposals come from them. I mean, you know, the lawyers in the room, but if you read Article 153 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, it's a minefield, it's a jungle, it's terrible. We always need at least half a year with our own lawyers, and then we need another year with the council lawyers, and then and then the parliament, but we're getting there. And it's interesting, and an anecdote, but just to make it clear for people who are maybe not experts, on the minimum wage, the proposal on the minimum wage is really technically and legally very complicated. But now, after everybody said to us, you can't do it, you don't have the competence, now all three legal services have said that we do have the competence. So there is progress. And I think the European Union is also, in that sense, quite flexible, that if there is a real urge to do something, and most of the time these are external pressures, sadly in a way. I mean, nobody wanted the pandemic, but it's the pandemic that created, that doubled the budget of the EU. All of a sudden it was possible to create the Recovery and Resilience Facility, Next Generation EU, which doubles the budget. The same was tried, I think in 2009, 2010. The treaty hasn't changed, but the legal basis that was found now was not acceptable then and is acceptable now. And again, this may partially due to the kind of crisis. Nobody could blame the Italians for suffering as the first under the pandemic. It's different than the financial crisis. But I think also, again, the departure of the UK helped. I mean, tragically in this case. And now again with Ukraine, I think you will see again a reinforcement. I mean, if I can mention here the in my view, fantastic advantage we have now with Ukraine compared to with Syria is that the Ukrainians do not need a visa, so they can come in on the basis of a valid passport and they can stay for 90 days in the whole of the EU. On top of that, the Council triggered the Temporary Protection Directive, which many people had forgotten about, from 2002, made after the Balkan crisis. And now we use it, and this is an enormous help because it means that Ukrainians don't have to be first processed individually, each one of them, as an asylum seeker. They are traveling freely, and under this directive, member states are in fact obliged to give them essentially the same rights and the access to the same facilities that our own citizens have. So again, this is an enormous advantage that we have. The basis from which we start is a lot better than in 2015.
That Jeroen has eagerly picked up the microphone.
No, I was smiling a little bit because Joost said about the Temporary Protection Directive and that people had forgotten about it, which is true because last year the Commission even presented a proposal to repeal it because we never used it. So it was made in the wake of the Balkan Wars. And we've also often said, but because in 2015 for the Syrians we didn't use it, and if we never use it, you might as well repeal it. So the Commission presented a proposal to repeal it last year, and we're not even a couple of months later, and we're actually using it to improve the position of 3.5 million Ukrainians. So in that sense, it's always interesting to see how also external events really shape the way we use policy. And to come back to the question, because I think it's a source of great frustration for whether you're from the Commission or a researcher or a member of the Parliament, when you make the laws, you make rules in order to improve the situation, to make the European labour market fairer, so not only a free market, but a fair mobility market. It's very frustrating to then see that often these rules are not always implemented, and even if they're implemented, not always enforced, because these are two different things. And this is not even limited to the social field per se, but I think in the whole European model of governance, the idea is always that you make regulations and directives at the European level, but ultimately it's up to the member states to implement and enforce them. And if they don't do so, of course, the Commission can start infringement proceedings, dialogues with member states, but they're often lengthy processes, very time consuming, and don't always lead to effective and quick results. And we should really think about a way to improve this. And of course, it's very difficult because you immediately step on all sorts of national competences. But I think it's really unacceptable that if you see some of the directives that we have, how many infringement procedures against how many member states the Commission has to start in order to get some movement on them. I don't understand if you come in a room with 27 people, you put your signature under a regulation, so often unanimously adopted, that then it has to take 10 years to implement it. And once it's implemented, it's often not enforced. It's greatly frustrating, and it's wider than only social affairs, and we really should find better ways of doing so. I mean, the European Labour Authority was mentioned. I think this is a very interesting new agency. It's just operational in Bratislava now. It will need some time to really make a lasting impression, but in the sense of cross-border inspections, for instance, I think it can do a lot of work in enforcement, and we really need those kind of initiatives in order to make sure that whatever we do here in the European Parliament and the Council is not only a paper reality, but it becomes also reality in practice, because otherwise we can agree on all the most beautiful laws in the world, but it doesn't make a difference. And I think, but that's to something else related, we also need to be a little bit careful about expectations management at the European level, because indeed, all legal services have agreed that the proposal for minimum wage is correctly in the legal basis and it can be done. But I think if you talk to European citizens, they have a different idea of what a European law on minimum wage would do than what this directive is ultimately doing, because the European Union simply doesn't have the competence to decide whether there should be some sort of a minimum standard for minimum wages. But in a lot of communications, it is a lot of ambitious talk about European minimum wage, while I'm afraid that in the end, in practice, it will not make a huge difference. It's still important, but it will not make the difference that maybe many people expect from it when they hear that there will be a European legislation on minimum wage. And I think if we constantly present ambitious proposals which do not have ambitious consequences, it also hurts a little bit the public support that you have for this kind of policy at the European level.
Yeah, I don't have that much to add on this. But I think indeed it's very important that things do get implemented. And also I agree that maybe expectation management should be taken into account when we're talking about the minimum wage. But I am very much in favor of the fact that there will be something on minimum wage and for the platform directive as well. I mean, of course, the whole, the ETUC is more involved in this, but there's definitely things we'd like to improve on it. But I think it's very important to get some real European consolidation of how to tackle with these things. Inequality being joined over countries, so it is good to tackle that Europeanly. And platforms, definitely, it's important to have some European legislation there. Just wanted to quickly add to what's been said now on the, unfortunately, there's a big inflow of Ukrainian refugees due to the crisis, well, the war there. That indeed it is good that there are these policies in place, there is the free movement, that there is temporary protection. And we know from, I mean, hopefully it won't last very long, this is completely out of my expertise, but if you are talking about integration of refugees, asylum seekers into societies, the only thing that comes out from the literature really is that the importance of stability and a stable regulatory framework from the very beginning that can help people settle, get on their feet, and then so I think this is a very good thing that has happened there. Thanks also to the member states bordering that have acted so welcoming, so quickly.
Yeah, so on that note, I would like to move on to talk about labour mobility and fair employment. So labour mobility is really at the heart of the European project. However, there are a number of issues with how freedom of movement operates in practice that both the member states and ordinary citizens have to juggle. And so I wondered what you felt were some of the opportunities and some of the challenges that labour mobility brings.
I mean, I think you mentioned it in the introduction that I come from the Dutch-Belgian border region. My house is about 500 meters from the Belgian border. It's in Limburg. And without labor mobility and without free movement of workers and services, every worker and every company in my region would be cut in half in terms of the area it could serve, about the place he could work. I think labor mobility is hugely important, especially in border regions, for people who can find an employment or offer services on both sides of the border. And I think sometimes in the public debate in the Netherlands, definitely, this is completely overshadowed by negative examples or scandals that erupt on free movement of labor. So I think we need to stand strongly for labor mobility. I think it is the core fundament of the European Union. And at the same time, we have to realize that with these freedoms also comes responsibility. A responsibility to organize it well, to make sure it doesn't lead to unfair competition, that it doesn't lead to lowering of standards for workers. And I think that has been the agenda that the Commission has followed since 2014 with Jean-Claude Juncker and Marianne Thyssen, to move from free mobility to fair mobility. And this is not something you can arrange, unfortunately, with clicking your fingers and saying tomorrow it's all going to be great. But it's a process, it's a trajectory that we've started and that we need to keep working on. And I think the improvements are already there. The idea of equal pay for equal work in the same place, as I think the core principle, also helps with integration. Because if you have a workplace where Dutch workers are constantly paid more than their Polish colleagues or their Bulgarian colleagues, you will never feel equal. You will never feel integrated in this workplace or in this society. So there is a lot of work to do there still. I think it starts with the realization that free movement is not only positive, that there are some concerns, and that there are, most importantly, that there are people and companies who are actively searching for ways to abuse free movement at the expense of mainly the workers involved. And we see those newspaper headlines, especially when it comes to accommodation of workers, when it comes to working arrangements, like you said, when it comes to dependency of third country workers on their bosses, people that have to hand in their passports, and if they don't listen to their boss, they just get kicked out of the country. There's a lot of examples, and these are things we need to work on. But in general, we should stand firm for these principles because they are of enormous added value.
If I may quickly react, indeed. So first of all, there is absolutely no doubt that labor mobility and migration in general is hugely beneficial. So, I mean, I know there's always talk about possible negative effects and downward trends, but actually that doesn't really bear out that much. It's generally positive, but what there is a risk of is that many workers do tend to be at a risk of being in bad jobs, being, and this even holds for EU mobile workers. They tend to be in, on average, relatively worse job than the nationals themselves. They tend to have lower prospects for growth, for improvement, and they tend to be overqualified. So these are all things that should be improved and that should be taken care of to be improved. So, and then, of course, there's the absolute excesses of the exploitation of seasonal workers, of temporary migrants, which is worse for third country nationals, but was also very bad for some EU workers. And that is, with the opening up of Europe, I think there is a risk of this exploitation which has to be tackled more, because in some countries there is workers from many of the Central and Eastern European countries tend to work in relatively bad jobs, which is not a problem for the other workers, but it's a problem for them very much. And I think this is important to tackle. Then on a personal note, I'm very much in favor of freedom of movement. So I met my wife through Erasmus and I'm quite happy with that. Still today, yes, sir. But I mean, the important part is on the workers, and the other thing's not that crucial.
I mean, don't have all that much to add. I think I agree with everything that was said. Today, according to the best of our estimates, there are about between 13 and 14 million Europeans who are who are living in another member state than they came from. So these are the workers themselves, plus their families, which is a sizable member state. So that's actually quite a lot. There was more, again, before Brexit. I think I could always say it's about the size of the Netherlands, 17.5 million, I think, at the time. Now it's gone down a bit. We will actually come out very quickly with a report on mobility, and it shows the effect of Brexit. Of course, it also shows that more broadly that things are changing in the sense that people are moving back also to the countries where they came from. And this, I think, goes a bit in the direction of what was said by the previous speakers, that it is, they tend to be coming for jobs that are maybe not the best, but they also tend to go back after a while to where they came from, because the European Union is, at the end of the day, also a big convergence machine. And you see this. I mean, if you compare Poland now with 10 or 15 years ago, it's an enormous difference. And this is, again, something we should all be, I think, be very proud of. In spite of all the criticism, all the issues we have with a number of countries, this is still very much effective and working every day. And I think that is, maybe those are two important points to make. Indeed, also, I think when we look at free movement of workers, and notably, of course, the posting of workers, which is, as you know, technically, legally, again, another chapter, and seasonal workers, there's obvious abuse. Everybody knows this, and the Commission is very much aware of it. Major progress was made at the level of the legislation. And it's not finished, it's still ongoing, but we're working on it. But at the end of the day, I think I can reasonably say that the legislation is pretty much okay. The legislation to fight the abuses, to protect the people, is there. And it's down to implementation and enforcement. And that's why, I mean, the trade unions play a very important, and I think a very good role here, to actually enforce it on behalf of people. And this is also the good thing of the legal order that we have, that, you know, this is possible in the EU. I mean, a member state can obviously neglect a directive or a regulation or not implement it, but at the end of the day, citizens have the possibility to go to the courts and be represented by trade unions or others, and they, at the end of the day, they'll win. It's a very painful, long process, but it's not possible at the end of the day for member states to escape this responsibility. This is also one of the, I think, enormous advantages we have in this EU, that it's enforceable in law, and that there is a court of justice, and at the end of the day, it will be corrected. It just takes a long time. That's painful and not good at all for the overall image of the.
Yep. So I think a final question from me before we open up to our audience, and it's about the future of the EU. So I want to, so if we look to the future of the EU, its resilience and the sustainability of the European social model, what challenges do you see ahead for the European Union? And possibly, how do we overcome them?
I can start. You can criticize me, contest it. No, I mean, the future of the EU, broadly, well beyond the social Europe, is something that we don't agree on. I think we need to be. I have no hesitation to say this. That's all. That's why we have these fantastic phrases like an ever-growing union, closer union between the peoples of Europe. That is, I think, what we all agree on. But otherwise, whether it will become a federation or whatever, I think this is somehow in the clouds. We don't know. And it will be determined, I think, much more by events than by maybe, free will of the people. So that's my first point. The second point, I mean, on social Europe, let me also go back to where we started. And I'm also realistic enough to say that just to say that you're in favor of social Europe, or even to say I'm in favor of Europe, doesn't actually solve any problem. I'm very much in favor of European integration, and I'm very much in favor of social Europe, but the question is really, what does it mean? And are you in favor of a more liberal Europe or more in favor of a social democratic Europe? It's a political discussion, not that different from the discussions I think we have in the member states. And there are coalitions in the European Union, and there are compromises in the European Union, dirty compromises, exactly as they are done also at home, and we know this very well. What is missing, however, in all this discussion is that I always think sort of an honesty of politicians to say this, and that you are, let me say, the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, who is happy and actually extremely good in doing compromises at home, and he stands up for them and he defends them, and he contradicts himself sometimes, but this is totally accepted. But then when it comes to Europe, somehow everything is always presented black and white, or it's not him. It's the European Union, as if it's almost, you know, a foreign nation that imposes things. And I think the debate would win a lot by somebody saying, okay, I am responsible first and foremost for the Dutch people. I'm elected by you. You are my first interest, but I also am fully responsible for what I do on your behalf in the EU. And that would give a lot of space for, I think, a much more honest debate. For me, finally, again, it sounds a bit maybe presumptuous, but I am personally quite convinced that further steps in the integration process are not possible without a stronger investment in the social side of things. I think that the people will just not accept it. And there are a lot of enemies of the European integration as well. We should not forget it. They're quiet now because they are, of course, ashamed by what's happening again in Russia and in Ukraine, but they are still there. And this is not a given. So it also means that even though from my perspective, I always wonder, there's only one way forward. I'm realistic enough that this is not the case. And things can unwind and things can change quite rapidly. People do stupid things. Politicians also. Referenda sometimes lead to very strange results. So I think, and I'm saying this because I also to call upon the younger generation to really be aware of this, and it's a constant struggle. And I see at the end of the day the European Union as the best possible platform to solve these issues. In itself, it doesn't solve it, but it's a platform where people meet every day peacefully to discuss and to move forward very slowly, but nevertheless, at the end of the day, highly successful.
But to speak about the future of Europe is always a very difficult question, of course, that could provoke me to give a very, very long answer, which I will not do. But I think one thing that was said is really, really important and frustrating at the same time, namely that the European Union and the further development of the European Union will more likely be shaped by events than by free democratic choices of the member states, because we have learned that a lot of things that were never possible became possible when there's a crisis. And I would really be very happy if we could be a little bit more preventive, proactive in the European Union. So we don't need to let a crisis unfold before we take action, but we can actually work together to help prevent crisis. Of course, Ukraine, Russia is a different matter in that sense, but many, many other crises, we could have done a lot more to prepare ourselves if we would have taken the steps before a crisis hit us instead of only afterwards. And at the same time, yes, Europe will move slowly but successfully, and I'm convinced of that as well. And you only have to look at the history to have confidence in the future for that as well. I mean, I'm from 1984, so I was 5 years old when the wall fell. It's not something I have any real memory of awareness. And I often wondered if you would ask people like around my birth, saying, you know, because in those days when I was born, it was still the height of the Cold War. The Soviet Union was boycotting the Olympics in Los Angeles. There were discussions in the Netherlands about nuclear missiles being stored or not from the US. And I really wonder if you would have asked people, so, you know, in 30 years from now, you know, Hungary and the Czech Republic and Slovakia will be members of the same union as the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, that in Austria and Germany will pay with the same euro as in Latvia and Lithuania, that you can drive your car from southern Portugal to Finland without even seeing a border post or a military or showing your passport, that you can work in any of these countries without any obstacle. I really think people in the 80s would have probably said, "Oh, you're crazy. This is not very realistic." At the same time, it is the position where we are in now. And yes, there is lots of challenges. But if you look at what has been achieved in the past 30 years, and you would be able to achieve the same amount of progress in the next 30 years, we will be in a completely different European Union. And we need it, because it was always one of Jean-Claude Juncker's favorite statistics. But at the beginning of the 20th century, we Europeans, broadly speaking, were about 25% of the world's population. By the end of this century, with a little bit of luck, we'll still be 4 or 5% of the world's population. So in 2 centuries, we've changed from 1 in 4 people on the world as European to 1 in 25 people on the world as European. If we want to maintain our social model, if we want to maintain our welfare, our security, it is absolutely crucial that we continue to invest in European cooperation and European integration, because together we'll stand much stronger in an ever-growing world than we'll do on our own. And we'll only be able to do so also by sticking to this European model, that we make sure that we have equality, we have welfare standards, we take care of the people, and economic growth is evenly distributed. That's the only way that the European Union can also prosper in the future.
I will not venture to say much about the future, because I don't know, and I think the 2 other speakers are better placed. But I do want to speak just a little bit about, again, the social model, and what is something important about the European social model, and has played a very important role, and that is the strong social dialogue, the strong collective agreements. And that is a risk that I think, and it struck me in the last panel as well, the importance of trade unions on the ground, and what you apparently have to do, both organize and provide NGO work. But I mean, this is a very important thing, and this is something crucial about Europe. We do have strong collective agreements, or we used to, and this, I think, is a very strong risk. And I think it's important to try and prop this up, sponsor this as much as possible. I know there's plans to talk about 60% collective agreement coverage, maybe even more. But this is something that's been declining over time. We've just done a study seeing that over the last 20 years, collective agreement coverage has gone down. That has repercussions for job quality, for wages. We see how important they can be to really talk about these excesses, to bring it back to migration. I mean, one of the only real ways to tackle this, if the labor authorities are powerless or can't do much, is from the bottom up, with organization of workers, with letting people know their rights. And for that, you need strong social partners. And obviously, being from the Trade Union Institute, I'll talk about one side of the social partners, but strong trade unions and strong collective agreements are, I think, important. And are one of the ways in which the EU can be this diverse and tackle the different challenges on the different member states, because you have this bottom-up approach. So I'll stop there. I think it worked in the past, and I think it will be important in the future.
So thank you very much. I'm going to hand it over to our audience now for any questions. Excellent.
Yeah, so after this great debate, the union can't be quiet. So we know each other, so I do not further need to introduce the union. Mr. Korte. So it's a discussion, so let's be Dutch. If I was Director General at DG Employment, I wouldn't have a minute of time to speculate if Putin will or won't sign the European social pillar. I would more consider, through the EU member state who signs the pillar and do this with the pillar, and do not even protect the Russian workers from Putin's country who work in the EU, because that's the reality of big parts of the labor market. So I would be more concerned to do safeguard the treaty, what we saw in my previous discussion was, I explained our legal actions and you gave us a compliment, but basically my intervention was, it's poor that the trade union needs to burn money, hiring lawyers to sue public authorities and safeguard the EU treaty. As far as I know, it's a big pillar of the job of the committee, of the Commission. In the enforcement directive, we now see in the implementation that several member states maybe implement the enforcement directive a bit too enthusiastic, where the Commission says, here the free market might be harmed. What I do not understand, and I really hope you can help me, that's the question. Are there any intentions or in the history in the recent past where the committee started infringement procedures against member states who did not do their duty to safeguard the social pillar? Simply execute the protection of workers on the EU market? Because I don't have an example. And we as unions, not only in court, but also in parliament, feel ourselves the protector of the social pillar. And it should be not our job. It should be the committee who also steps up against member states who do not do what they should do according to the treaty we all signed. And if we manage to safeguard that all, we start speculating about if Putin will ever sign it.
No problem. I mean, I only mentioned Putin not because I want him to sign the European Bill of Social Rights, but only to underline that how happy we should be that we are living somewhere where it actually applies. On the other question, which is a really good one, and one where I think you have reasons to be unhappy. We are quite active as a Commission on the infringement front. But of course, at the end of the day, it's also a political process, and we have to be selective. You said posting. We have launched infringement procedures against 24 member states for exaggerating, discriminating actually, discrimination between more strict on posted workers from outside than on your own workers. This is essentially the claim. Now, luckily, the fact that we wrote these letters already makes that 5 or 6 have changed. So we're making a lot of progress. And it's in that context that we will then in the end have to decide, not me, but the Commission, whether we go to the court for the others, that we have to see. I'm not sure I agree with you that it can only be the Commission. I mean, the beauty of the EU is that also, as I said, I think in one of my contributions, that individuals can also enforce it. I mean, if it were only for the Commission, we would never have had the progress that we see in the EU. It is most of the cases that actually go to the court, most of the jurisprudence is triggered by individuals who have an issue, and then it's through that the legal order evolves so much in the EU with this direct effect and enforceable rights for individuals. Now, this doesn't mean, of course, that we will never start a case against the Netherlands. But again, the issue is not so much, I think, compatibility of actions of the state. It's much more actions of companies that you are worried about. And then, of course, the lack of the state authorities to enforce. That is also legally quite complicated. I mean, the Netherlands will tell us, there is the law. We have done exactly what we need to do under EU law, and it's enforced. And if companies don't apply by the law, okay, we will take action against them. But for us then to take them to court because they don't take this action is not so easy. That's ultimately also a bit the weakness of the system in which we are operating. I do, however, want to say also that, I should have said it earlier on, that indeed the social partners, the trade unions and also employers' organizations are absolutely essential in this whole. And that's why we're coming also with a communication after the summer and also actually with a recommendation, the council recommendation. We can't go further than a recommendation because we don't again have the legal power to advance social partners, to promote social partners, because as I said, the number of people that are a member of the trade union is going down, and this is not going to help us. Voila.
Next question.
Well, thank you. I would have a question, maybe first to the three of you, and then one specifically for Mr. Korte. My name is Imke van Garding, and I work for FNV as well, as a policy advisor on labor migration. And I just heard the three of you applaud the work of the trade unions. So my first question would be, are you all members of the trade union? Very good. Well, that's a pity. And my question to Mr. Korte would be specifically on third country national labor migration. Because we have, on the one hand, member states who have a sovereign right to allow third country national workers on the labor markets. And then we have, on the other hand, the posting of third country nationals. And these seem to be kind of conflicting rights. And I was just wondering, could you share some thoughts on this specific item, specific issue?
Well, I think posting of workers, why is there so much posting of workers? Because there's a shortage of labor. This is, I think, the economic reality in the EU, and this is not going to get any better because our populations are declining. There are less of us, and so there's a shortage of labor. In a way, again, it's all a bit cynical maybe to say, but nevertheless, this is probably the truth. Every cloud has a silver lining. The Ukrainians, if they're staying, would actually be able to contribute a lot to our labor force. They are potentially a very good complement to our workforce, but of course it's a terrible thing to say because we all hope that they will be able to return. The sooner the better. Now, so that's one point. Second point, I think third country nationals, it's true. It's true that it's a sovereign decision of every member state to let them in. This is not, there's no EU law on this, which is in a way a handicap, because it stops the EU from having what could be a much more sensible immigration policy. Commission is coming forward in April with more proposals to which is called an EU talent pool, whereby the EU member state would sit together and say, so where are the shortages? What are the kind of jobs we need, people we need for jobs, and then try to set up a system that we look for those people from Africa and other places. This is how many other countries in the world do this, and would, I think, make a lot of sense. Once they are in the EU, third country nationals, there is the directive which obliges member states to treat them exactly the same as our own workers. So there can be no discrimination, whether they are third country nationals or EU citizens, once they're in legally established with a permit. And then you have the other thing you mentioned, is you can also get into the EU third country nationals who are posted. This is a model that is quite becoming more and more attractive. And we know that there are many companies, I think particularly in the Balkans, who recruit, let's say, nationals of Central Asia, or who are then coming in under posting into the EU. This is much more complicated. Now, the rules, of course, are, and I think much less welcome in a way, I would say. It's a bit of a gap, but still, in terms of protection of these people, it should not make any difference. They have, again, the same rights as the European citizens in a posting relationship. So how this is then again enforced and controlled and monitored is a different thing. I mean, we have been actually, I know one country, I think it's Slovenia, which has been very active here. There are many, I think, agencies in Slovenia that recruit people, let's say, from Asia or Africa, and then put them in a posting in Austria in particular, and that is, yeah, problematic. much more, of course, much more difficult, I think, to monitor and to follow than if it's workers from who are in a posting operation, who are EU citizens. Again, what can be done? I think Jeroen mentioned European Labour Authority a couple of times. I also want to underline that this is not a panacea, and it will require a lot of work and time to make it really make sure it makes a difference. But it is the way forward. I think it is that sort of agencies and bodies where the inspection bodies of the member states sit together on a daily basis in the same office, and where you have direct contact with the capitals, so that also the lack of communication, the lack of trust sometimes between member states, the language barriers that are there can be mended. I mean, you'll be surprised how poor member states' administrations still are when it comes to these European issues. I think it's essentially because there are too few officials. Again, all these services, the labor inspectors in particular, have been cut quite brutally in the early parts of the century. But it's more than that. It's also, I think, a lack of comprehension, a lack of focus, too much focus domestic on their own issues, and too little eye for the incredible importance of what's happening across the border. In the EU, this idea, I mean, again, it sounds a bit stupid to say, but we're in this together. It doesn't make much difference. It doesn't make much point for the Dutch to only focus on what's happening in the Netherlands. There should be a permanent contact with everybody around them, and that's why ELA and other networks, I think, can help a lot. But I mean, not tomorrow.
Just to add, and also with regards to the first question, because I hadn't applauded the trade unions yet, so let me just to be correct, do that here as well. No, I'm joking. I do think it's a problem, because I do think you can speak about conflicting rights. If you see that there is more people being posted from Slovenia in the construction sector to other EU member states than there's actually people working in the construction sector in Slovenia, I think there's a problem. And the whole point of posting is that you normally carry out your work in the member state where you normally carry out your work, but you're being sent to another member state to temporarily provide a service. But none of these people, and in this case, I think mainly it's people from Bosnia and surrounding countries, none of these people actually carry out any work in Slovenia before they are posted. So it's not posting, actually. And even the Slovenian authorities admit basically that they do not have the time or the capacity to check for every individual worker who is being sent to another member state to provide a posting, to check whether he actually normally carries out his work in Slovenia, which is not the case. And I think this is really a problem. And we've also asked some questions about this together with the trade unions in the construction sector, because it's really worrying if this is the way to circumvent many of the rules we have. And again, identifying the problem is always a little bit easier than finding the solution. But I do think it's more than problematic that we are in this situation, because it opens the door not only to this particular case in Slovenia with Bosnians, but it opens the door to quite wide abuse of the rules that we have. So we need to find a solution. How? I don't have an answer, I'm sorry, but that it is a problem. We should do something about it. I'm quite convinced.
I just want to react on this as well, because what I heard you say that we have to post workers because there's a worker shortage, and therefore other workers have to come in. That's all well and good if they do indeed work at exactly the same conditions as they should be. And we know from research, from anecdotal evidence, and it became super clear during the pandemic, that the conditions are often much worse, and they're either borderline or full-on illegal. And in that case, you do have a problem, and you do get, I mean, research shows there's no real undercutting yet, but there's at least that perception, which is itself also damaging. Where you get the idea that, I think, again, I'm gonna refer to the previous panel, but where you have the idea that workers are set up against each other, and is the enemy the Polish truck driver or the Kyrgyz truck driver? Or no, it is the system that allows for these excesses to exist, even when they're known. So I think here indeed, posted work is all well and good, and I'm all for labor mobility, but it does have to be on an equal footing for everyone involved.
Thank you very much. And I think on that note, it might be time for everybody to go and get a drink. You too. Yeah, thank you everyone who participated in the earlier panels, and also thank you to our audience, both here and on Zoom, and for participating. I've really enjoyed the day, and I hope you have as well. So yeah, thank you very much. Right, I believe that drinks are